to the limitation of the working day in England, as in all other countries, it has never been settled except by legislative interference. Without the working men's continuous pressure from without, that interference would never have taken place. But at all events, the result was not to be attained by private settlement between working men and the capitalists. This very necessity of general political action affords the proof that in its merely economical action, capital is on the stronger side. As to the limits of the value of labor, its actual settlement always depends upon supply and demand. I mean, the demand for labor on the part of capital and the supply of labor by the working men. In colonial countries, the law of supply and demand favors the working man. Hence, the relatively high standard of wages in the United States. Capital may there try its utmost. It cannot prevent the labor market from being continuously emptied by the continuous conversion of wages laborers into independent, self-sustaining peasants. The position of a wages laborer is, for a large part of the American people, but a probational state, which they are sure to leave within a longer or shorter term. To mend this colonial state of things, the paternal British government accepted for some time what is called the modern colonization theory, which consists in putting an artificial high price on colonial land in order to prevent too quick conversion of the wages laborer into the independent peasant. But let us now come to old civilized countries in which capital domineers over the whole process of production. Take, for example, the rise of England, in England, of agricultural wages from 1849 to 1859. What was its consequence? The farmers could not, as our friend Weston would have advised them, raise the value of wheat, nor even its market prices. They had, on the contrary, to submit to their fall. But during these 11 years, they introduced machinery of all sorts, adopted more scientific methods, converted a part of the arable land into pasture, increased the size of the farms, and with the scale of production, and by these other processes, diminishing the demand for labor by increasing its productive power, and made agricultural population relatively redundant. This is the general method in which a reaction, quicker or slower, of capital against a rise of wages takes place in old settled countries. Ricardo has justly remarked that machinery is in constant competition with labor and can often be only introduced when the price of labor has reached a certain height. But the appliance of machinery is but one of many methods for increasing the productive powers of labor. The very same development which makes common labor relatively redundant simplifies, on the other hand, skilled labor and thus depreciates it. The same law applies in another form. With the development of the productive powers of labor, the accumulation of capital will be accelerated, even despite a relatively high rate of wages. Hence, one might infer, as Adam Smith, in in whose days modern industry was still in its infancy, did infer that the accelerated accumulation of capital must turn the balance in favor of the working man by securing a growing demand for his labor. From the same standpoint, many contemporary writers have wondered that English capital, having grown in the last 20 years so much quicker than the English population, wages should not have been more enhanced. But simultaneously with the progress of accumulation, there takes place a progressive change in the composition of capital. That part of the aggregate capital which consists of fixed capital, machinery, raw materials, means of production, in all possible forms, progressively increases as compared with the other part of capital, which is laid out in wages or in the purchase of labor. This law has been stated more or less accurately by Mr. Barton, Ricardo, Sismondi, Professor Richard Jones, Professor Ramsey, Cherbulier, and others. If the proportion of these two elements of capital was originally 1:1, it will, in the progress of industry, become 5:1, and so forth. If a total capital of 600, 300 is laid out in instruments, raw materials, and so forth, and 300 in wages, the total capital wants only to be doubled to create a demand for 600 working men instead of 300. But if a capital of 600, 500 is laid out in machinery, materials, and so forth, and only 100 in wages, the same capital must increase from 600 to 3,600 in order to create a demand for 600 workmen instead of 300. In the progress of industry, the demand for labor keeps, therefore, no pace with the accumulation of capital. It will still increase, but the increase in a constantly diminishing ratio as compared with the increase of capital. These few hints will suffice to show that the development of modern industry must progressively turn the scale in favor of the capitalist against the working man, and that consequently the general tendency of capitalistic production is not to raise but to sink the average level of wages, or to push the value of labor more or less to its minimum limit. Such being the tendency of things in this system, is this saying that the working class ought to renounce their resistance against the encroachments of capital and abandon their attempts at making the best of occasional chances for their temporary improvement? If they did, they would be degraded to one level mass of broken wretches beyond salvation. I think I have shown that their struggles for the standard of wages are incidents inseparable from the whole wages system. That in 99 cases out of 100, their efforts at raising wages are only efforts at maintaining the given value of labor, and the necessity of debating their price with the capitalist is inherent to their condition of having to sell themselves as commodities. By cowardly giving way in their everyday struggle with capital, they would certainly disqualify themselves for the initiation of any larger movement. At the same time, and quite apart from the general servitude involved in the wages system, The working class ought not to exaggerate to themselves the ultimate working of these everyday struggles. They ought not to forget that they are fighting with effects, but not with the causes of those effects, that they are retarding the downward movement, but not changing its direction, that they are applying palliatives, not curing the malady. They ought therefore not to be exclusively absorbed in these unavoidable guerrilla fights, incessantly springing up from the never-ceasing encroachments of capital or of changes in the market. They ought to understand that with all the miseries it imposes on them, the present system simultaneously engenders the material conditions and social forms necessary for an economical reconstruction of society. Instead of the conservative motto, a fair day's wage for a fair day's work, they ought to inscribe on their banner the revolutionary watchword, abolition of the wages system. After this long and, I fear, tedious exposition, which I was obliged to enter to do some justice to the subject matter, I shall conclude by proposing the following resolutions. Firstly, a general rise in the rate of wages would result in a fall in the general rate of profit, but broadly speaking, not affect the prices of commodities. Secondly, the general tendency of capitalist production is not to raise, but to sink the average standard of wages. Thirdly, trade unions work well as centers of resistance against the encroachments of capital. They fail partially from an injudicious use of their power. They fail generally from limiting themselves to a guerrilla war against the effects of the existing system, instead of simultaneously trying to change it, instead of using their organized forces as a lever for the final emancipation of the working class. That is to say, the ultimate abolition of the wages system.